way down as many different things as you have, but it's still just one variable. You might have 5 different levels or 5 different types of that variable, but it's still just one variable. For example, persuasive strategies. Well, 5 different persuasive strategies, but it's still just one variable, which is persuasive strategy. And actually, I gave you an example last week of where this could go up as high as 35 when I was talking about that study with studying children's language development in like 35 different languages and 35 different cultures. You have X1 all the way to X35, but it's still just one variable, which is language. You have 35 different languages being studied, but that's still one variable. So all of our experimental designs that we've been talking about so far are only dealing with one independent variable. This next design is different from all of the others in the sense that it has more than one independent variable. So these are the factorial designs. And again, what factorial designs are, they're experiments, but they're experiments that have more than one independent variable. How many independent variables? It could be any number as long as there's more than one. I mean, it could be 2, 3, 4, 5. You're not usually going to find experiments that have too many different independent variables because it really becomes very complex, you know, in terms of coordinating things and analyzing data and stuff like that. But any design that has, any experiment that has more than one independent variable, that's a factorial design. What each independent variable is referred to as here, that's referred to as factors. So if they say they have a 2-factor factorial design, that means there's 2 independent variables. Each independent variable is identified or referred to as a factor. Now there is a nice little, what's referred to as a factorial statement, which really conceptually tells you the whole structural layout of the study. It doesn't tell you all the content, but it tells you the layout of the study. For example, a 2x2 factorial design. Well, what this means is that you have the way you would lay that out, this is where you're looking at your grids, and actually we've laid out some of these when we've talked about some sample kinds of research and stuff like that. You would have a grid like this, and here's like variable 1, we'll call it variable X, here's variable Y, and you've got maybe condition 1, condition 2, a variable X, condition 1, condition 2, a variable Y. So by 2x2, it means you have 2 independent variables, and you have 2 conditions under each independent variable. So what you know when you just read this statement of now again, 2x2 is just one example. I mean, it could be 2x3, 3x4. I'm just giving you one example. There's a variety of things that you know from just this statement right here, 2x2 factorial design. The number of numbers tells you how many independent variables they are. The numbers themselves don't tell you the variables. It's the number of numbers. So we have 2 numbers, 2 by 2. That means we have 2 independent variables. If we had a 2 by 2 by 2 design, we'd have how many independent variables? We'd have 3 independent variables. And the way that this kind of thing would be designed is you'd have this layout for Z, you know, Z1, and then you have the exact same layout here for Z2. So can you see you've got 3 different independent variables. You've got variable X, variable Y, and variable Z. And since you can't really grid that out in at least a 2-dimensional surface easily, you know, you could kind of lay it out this way, but that's still a 2 by 2 by 2 design. You've got 3 independent variables, X, Y, and Z. You've got 2 levels of each independent variable. There's 2 X's, there's 2 Y's, and there's 2 Z's. So, 2 things that we can tell already from our factorial statement. How many variables are there? How many conditions of each variable? That's the specific number. If this was a 2 by 3 instead of a 2 by 2, then we would add in condition 3. Let's go away from the 3 independent variables for a moment. So you can kind of see your 2 by 3. You still have 2 independent variables, 2 numbers. One variable has 2 conditions. The other variable has 3 conditions. So number 1, you can tell how many variables by the number of numbers. Number two, you can tell how many conditions of each variable by the specific number. One variable has 2 levels or 2 conditions, the other one has 3. And the other thing that you can tell is how many total conditions are there in the experiment, right? And that is just by multiplying it out. So, you know, you've got 6 total conditions. There's 2 conditions for the y variable, 3 conditions for the x variable, and when you multiply 2 times 3, 6, you've got 6 total conditions. So if we had a 3 by 4 design, how many independent variables?
2.
How many conditions of the first variable?
3.
How many of the second variable? How many total conditions?
12.
12, okay. And then you could just, you know, multiply, you just grid that out. 3 variables, 4 variables, you'd have 12 individual conditions that are in there. So that seemed an easier thing to get than sometimes it
I got the idea what you're saying, but I'm wondering if you can just like say something real world that would look like this.
Oh, you mean like what an actual study would be?
Yeah.
Yeah, believe me, I'll give you plenty of examples, or at least I'll give you enough, I think, to illustrate the point. I was just kind of mentioning what those things were.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's always good. That's kind of one of the next step along the line. I don't want to diagram it out too specifically. You really can, you know, if you're doing something like a randomized design, you know, just for continuity's sake, don't worry about memorizing this, but just for continuity, when we were doing our, you know, like our post test, you know, our full experimental kinds of designs, and again, this is assuming that it's a full experimental design for randomized subjects. It doesn't have to be a full experimental design. That's something I'll come back to in a moment. But this is the way that you would kind of lay this out if it was a 2 by 2. You know, you've got variable x12, you've got variable y12, and so really what you have is you have 4 different observations, right? You've got the y1, x1, which is here. You've got the y1, or you've got the x2, y1, which is here. You've got the x1, y2, which is here. And you've got the y2, x2, that's there. So, I mean, you're still looking at 4 observations. And much of the same kind of thing that we were talking about before is, you know, in terms of comparing what you would compare, you kind of still use these same sort of observations. When you're doing the factorial design, you're looking for 2 different kinds of things. Maybe it would be good to give the examples first before I talk about the 2 different kinds of things. So what you'd actually plug in here are your particular observations, and then if I were to say something like, you know, what's the effect of variable x, what's the effect of variable y, you know, that sort of thing, that's where you would be getting, you'd be identifying what your particular comparisons would be. Actually, you have O1, O2, O3, O4. So this would actually be O2 and that would be O3. So we don't worry about that kind of model. One thing that I wanted to come back to, the randomized full experiment, doesn't have to be that case. You could have a factorial design that's a quasi-experiment. It doesn't have to be a full experiment. You can have, you know, one that's a full experiment. Remember, the primary difference between quasi-experiment and a full experiment is the sampling procedures and the random distribution of subjects. Now, every quasi-experimental design could be a factorial. I mean, when you're doing something like the time series correlations or the time series repeated measures, that wouldn't conceptually fit. But where you could do a quasi-experiment factorial design is where you're doing something like the pre-post-test non-equivalent group design, you know, which lays out exactly like the pre-post-test full experiment does. You can still do a factorial design there. For the other types of quasi-experiments and for pre-experiments, factorial designs really don't conceptually make sense. Most of your factorial designs are going to be full experiments. An exception might be a pre-test, post-test, non-equivalent control group or comparison group design. Conceptually, that would be one type of quasi-design that could, you know, that could be a factorial design. So let me give you some examples of the way this might lay out, and then talk about the, you know, what you're doing in terms of identifying these. Let's take something relatively simple like a 2 by 2 design. One kind of study that was done a while back, and I've talked about this in some classes, was studying distraction. And it was kind of a groundbreaking thing at first to find that when people were exposed to relatively low levels of distraction, it actually increased the amount of information that they processed, instead of like common sense might think, which is distraction would decrease. Well, then further research kind of said, well, you know, one of the reasons for that probably is because, and we might have mentioned this in here before, when there's we have in comm theory, when there's a distraction, you probably pay more attention, you increase your mental effort in terms of listening, and you actually end up processing more information instead of less information. Well, a nice kind of follow-up question then is, well, if that's true, then if the message becomes really more complex, wouldn't that already take up a lot of that extra, you know, mental effort you're using that you wouldn't have then to channel to listen harder? Because you probably listen harder to a complex message than you do to a relatively simple message. So a great kind of 2x2 design here would be, okay, we want to measure, one variable is the distraction, and the second variable is the complexity of the message. And what we want to do is we want to take a no distraction condition, we want to have a low distraction condition, we're going to have a relatively simple message, and we're going to have a highly complex message. So can you see that what you're really doing here is you've got two variables, message complexity and distraction. And what you're really doing is you're looking at four different conditions here. What happens in the simple message, no distraction, simple message, low distraction, complex message, no distraction, complex message, low distraction, whereas here's no distraction. And one of the things that the research would indicate here is you don't necessarily find a difference just in terms of is there a difference in terms of message complexity, but what you do find is when it's a simple message and a low distraction, the amount of information people process actually goes up compared to when there's no distraction condition. When it's a highly complex message and there's a low distraction, the processing and the retention of the information comprehension is likely to go down. So, you know, you can see the benefit of a factorial design. You're not just looking at the effect of one variable, what happens with a simple compared to complex message, or just what happens with a low or no distraction. You're able to look at four different kind of comparisons, you know, based on those two variables. And this is one of the reasons a lot of times why people do this is because you might find differences in individual conditions that you don't find by the variable overall. And this would be a classic kind of example where if it's a simple message, then distraction improves your understanding and recall. If it's a highly complex message, then distraction actually decreases your processing and recall. And the underlying theoretical explanation I already mentioned would seem pretty intuitively obvious. If in the simple message, the reason why people end up processing more, in all likelihood is they just pay more attention, they concentrate more, and they end up overcompensating and processing more information. But if you're listening to a highly complex message, you're already listening really carefully, and you're already listening really intently, so it's like you don't have all that extra dormant potential just laying around not being used, and then the distraction is likely to decrease the message effectiveness. So that would be one kind of example. Now, I am going to give you some other kind of examples as well. When we're looking for the types of effects in, well, first, I guess the first thing here is we went through and we explained what the factorial statement is. When you're looking for the types of effects, though, from the factorial experiment, you're really looking, you have three different kinds of effects that you could be looking for. It's actually two types, but two subcategories of one. One type of effect that you're looking for is a main effect. And a main effect is there just an effect of your variable overall, of the variable individual variables. So for example, if we were looking here at our distraction study and we were looking for a main effect, we wouldn't even worry about the second variable. The first thing we would do is just to compare overall, was this condition different from this condition? So what you're really doing here, you know, if we've got 01, 02, 03, and 04, what we're really doing is we're saying 01 and 02 combined compared to 03 and 04 combined. And is there a difference just in terms of message complexity? So this kind of question for a main effect would be, is there a difference in recall and comprehension of information depending upon whether it's a simple message or a complex message. And if there was a main effect, that means you would find some kind of difference between these two conditions combined and these two conditions combined. Can you see why? Because these two are both simple messages, these two are both complex messages. But then also you'd be looking for, what about a main effect for this variable? If this is variable X, what about a main effect for variable Y? And that's where you would do the other comparison. You'd say, well, okay, let's look at O1 and O3 combined and compare that with O2 and O4 combined. And we're not worried about the simple complex message. We're just saying, for everyone that was exposed to no distraction, is there a difference in comprehension and recall compared to everyone that was exposed to a low distraction condition? And actually, this is without the second variable. That's kind of the way the research was originally done, just finding that when there was a distraction, people remembered more information. There was some persuasion research, which is actually, preceded it, that showed that people were more persuaded when there was a distraction, those kinds of things. And then it's subsequent research that came along later down the line and said, well, gee, I bet there's a difference here in terms of, the complexity of the message. And then, let me give one other thing out. You could even see, in terms of generating future research, you could even see this becoming a 2x3 design, where you said, well, we're only looking at no distraction or low distraction. What about a high level of distraction? So you might include another kind of distraction now, which would be a high level, and in which case your numbers here would change. But what you end up now with is a 2x3. You still just have two variables, distraction and complexity, but you've got 3 levels of the distraction variable, whereas before you only had 2. Cory?
Just like you talk about, if when you put them together, if you put O1 and O3 together, O2 and O4, is there a difference?
Right.
How do you put them together?
Well, you just add them all, like when you're comparing, you get your results. Keeping with this study, just to keep it grounded, obviously what you do is you have people listen to a message, distraction or no distraction, then you give them some kind of assessment in terms of what they understood and what they remembered after the fact. So with your O1 and O3, you would take all these people that had no distraction, not making any separation of what kind of message. You take all the people here and all the people here, and then group them all together, and then compare that with these two grouped together. So what you're basically doing is, you're treating all these people, for studying the main effect, you're treating all these people as one group. So when I say put them together, it's not that you're adding each one on top of each other. It's that you would group these two groups together as one group. This group and this group were all the no distraction conditions, so we'd look at all those together. We compare that with all these people linked together.
I guess the problem I have though is, for the simple and low distraction, their comprehension went up, for complex low went down. So would that just equal off as neutral? How would you compare those?
That means there would be, at least so far, that would mean there was, just by what we were showing there, that means that there wouldn't have been a main effect.
Okay.
Now, in the original research, though, there was a main effect of just distraction or no distraction, and that's where people come along later and say, gee, I wonder if it makes any difference in terms of the complexity of the message. So when we say we put them all together, it's you treat all these as one group. You'd actually put both of these groups together, and that would be one observation. You put both of these together, and that would be another observation. So that's one thing you're looking for, is you're looking to see, is there a main effect of variable X by itself, which would combine these two, and then compare. Is there a main effect for variable Y by itself? You would combine these two and compare it with these two. That's one kind of effect. A second kind of effect, and I'll come back and go over these again with a couple of other examples. A second kind of effect, and this is actually what I described in the original explanation of the distraction study, is an interaction. An interaction is where the particular combination of the two variables creates an effect by itself. And that's really what I had explained to begin with, where we have complexity, we have distraction, we have high complexity, low complexity, we have no distraction, we have low distraction. So when I said here, when there's low distraction, actually I designed it the other way around. I put the simple message here instead of low complexity. Put the simple message here, put the complex message here. When we said that in the low distraction condition, recall went up, in the complex message condition, recall went down. Well, that's describing an interaction. It's not just an effect of comparing the simple compared to the complex message. It's not just an effect comparing no distraction and low distraction. This was an interaction, meaning that there was something about the particular combination of the two variables here that produced a different effect than the particular combination of the two variables here. And so that's an interaction, is where the two things are interacting with each other. A main effect, you're treating each variable by itself, just complexity, just distraction. An interaction is where you're saying there's an interaction or there's an effect of these two things on each other. Another example of a study that we did, that we talked about, we had the results and I explained it a little bit, and that was the listening study. Now, I did use that the other day as an example of how it was originally designed, but the listening study was really a good example here in terms of, well, I'll let you make the factorial statement, where you had pausing as one of your independent variables. You either used the strategic pauses at key points of information, or you did not use strategic pauses at key points of information. Originally, the way the study was done, I mean, they still had all the data there, but the first analysis, it was just using it as a single variable study. Was there a difference in using pauses or not using pauses? And overall, when you looked at all the subjects together, there was no effect of pausing. But you may remember, and again, I'm about to remind you, that then they went in and they separated below average listeners, average listeners, and above average listeners based on their scores on the Brown-Carlson listening test. And so what you really did was add in a whole nother variable here, which was listeners as a separate independent variable. You've got below average listeners, you've got average listeners, and you've got above average listeners. So we've just added in a second variable, which is listeners with 3 different levels. So in terms of your factorial statement, what have we just designed here? What would your factorial statement be? Yeah, 2 by 3 design. Usually put the smaller number first. A 2 by 3 design, right? You've got 2 variables, pauses, listeners, 2 levels of the pause, use it or don't use it, 3 levels of the listener, above average, average, or below average, and we have 6 total conditions. So, and this is a good example of where they actually found, an interaction. There was not a main effect of using pauses or not using pauses. Obviously, there was a main effect in terms of, keep in mind, the dependent variable here was how much did you remember from the information that you listened to. Obviously, there was a main effect for listeners. The above average listeners remembered more, the average listeners remembered less than the above, but more than the below average. But the big thing there, if you remember the results, and again, I'm about to remind you, is for the above average and the average listener, there was no difference in terms of whether pauses were used or pauses weren't used. But the people that there were a difference for was for the below average listener. Their retention of information went up, it increased, when they used the pause compared to not using the pause. And actually, maybe another way of thinking of it is, it was when you're comparing these two, they tended to remember more with the pauses than not with the pauses, but it did not affect the other 2 types of listeners, the above average and the average listeners. So this was a classic example of an interaction, right? Not only is there a difference in how much you remember depending upon whether you're above average, average, or below average listener, there was no main effect of using pauses or not using pauses overall, but there was an interaction, because when the below average listeners listened to the message that had pauses, retention went up, even though it did not go up for the other 2 groups. So there was an interaction between the 2 variables. And again, the underlying theoretical explanation just kind of makes sense, right? Average listeners and above average listeners, you don't need to use strategically placed pauses because they can retain information, they can comprehend information without that extra assistance. The below average listener, they're the ones that need a little extra help, and so by the strategically placed pauses, that brought them up almost to the level of the average listener. So that's another classic example of, where there would be an interaction. You see the difference between an interaction and a main effect? Main effect is where you're just looking at one variable all those conditions combined, or the other variable, all those conditions combined. An interaction is where there's some kind of effect produced from the two variables playing on each other or interacting with each other. Now you do have different levels of interaction, like a zero order, a first order, a second order, but most of the time you don't need to go much further than a zero or a first order, first level interaction. And the reason for that is because each level up means that you're talking about another independent variable. And so most of the time you're not going to have enough independent variables that you'd ever go above, what a second order or a second level interaction would be. One other example that I was going to give, and again, it's a good example of where you can see both a main effect and an interaction. One of the concepts we talk about in persuasion when we're looking at different receiver characteristics, there's a cognitive characteristic called evaluative cognitive consistency. And this is related a lot to how much information somebody has on a topic. It's also related to how much knowledge, working knowledge they have about a topic. And they have found that, people can be either high or low in their evaluative cognitive consistency. In other words, a lot of information on a topic, a lot of certainty about your belief on that attitude or that topic is high evaluative cognitive consistency. Low evaluative cognitive consistency is where you don't have much information, you're not very certain, you don't really have a lot of, a lot of beliefs and a lot of strength of those beliefs for whatever your attitude or your opinion might be. Well, if you were just looking at a main effect and you were assessing how persuaded were people by a particular persuasive message, a lot of times you don't find a difference in whether, that high evaluative cognitive consistency people are more or less persuaded than low evaluative cognitive consistency. However, what research has shown is, wouldn't that be likely to differ though, depending upon the type of persuasive message, depending upon the type of argument? And kind of a classic example is, what if we take a strong argument, in other words, an argument that's very well supported, lots of facts, lots of statistics. Those of you that know what the elaboration likelihood model is, the kind of thing where you've got lots of central cues, lots of factual information, lots of logic, lots of support. And you compare that with a weak argument, which is the kind of argument that doesn't have a lot of facts, doesn't have a lot of support, it's based more on peripheral cues, extraneous things that don't really have anything to do with the strong substance of the message. And what if we did a comparison this way? So, what's our factorial design? 2 by 2, 2 independent variables, 2 levels of each, 4 total conditions. And here's another classic example of where you find an interaction. When you're just looking at the main effect of high-low cognitive consistency, research typically showed there is no difference. High cognitive consistency people compared to low cognitive consistency people, there isn't an overall difference in terms of one group being more persuadable than the other. However, when you look at the type of argument, you do find an interaction. The high cognitive consistency people are much more likely to be persuaded by a strong argument than they are by a weak argument. And the low cognitive consistency people are much more likely to be persuaded by a weak argument than the high cognitive consistency people. And it works the other way as well. The low cognitive consistency people were more likely to be persuaded by a weak argument than by a strong argument. The high more likely to be persuaded by a strong argument than a weak argument. So here's where you get an interaction. There's no effect in general of just high-low cognitive consistency, a value of cognitive consistency, but you find 2 different interactions here. Cognitive consistency interacts with this type of argument. Strong arguments that are really well supported, central processing cues, those kinds of things, your high value of cognitive consistency people are more persuaded. It makes sense. If you've got high value of cognitive consistency, you're more likely to be familiar with the information, you're more likely to recognize good quality argument, good substance, good support, facts, statistics, those kinds of things. Low cognitive consistency, you don't have that much information, you may not even be distinguishing the difference between a strong argument and a weak argument, and you're going to find them more persuaded, by the weak argument. This would be a fascinating study, actually, to do after one of the presidential debates, in terms of not just finding out who people thought won the debates, But if you could correlate that, or you could cross that with the value of cognitive consistency, it would be really interesting. If most of the people that thought, and I'm not gonna attach names to candidate A and B, we'll leave that obscure for now, but if most of the people that thought candidate A won the debate and did better were low cognitive consistency, and most of the people that thought candidate B won the debate were high in evaluative cognitive consistency, that might say something quite revealing about the types of arguments that were used in the debate and stuff like that. And actually, that, at least for the last debate, that might be something that actually shows to be true. So you see what a factorial design is, right? It's more than one independent variable. It can be 2, 3, 4. You're not going to have too many, because you can just imagine how complex this eventually becomes if you're getting too many variables in there. Most of your, now I'm not saying all, most of your factorial designs will not go any further than 3 independent variables. And even that sometimes is really stretching it. There's a lot that only use 2. Most of them aren't going to include 3 or more, unless it's a really lengthy, involved study. Somebody's dissertation might have more than 3 independent variables, because, you know, you're writing a book for your dissertation, and it's a really lengthy kind of thing. But most of the studies you find in journals aren't that involved, where they have more than 2 independent variables. Some might have 3. So you know what a factorial design is? More than one independent variable. You know the factorial statement. 2 different kinds of effects. Your main effects, which is there an effect of variable X? Is there an effect of variable Y? Interaction, the 2 things interact or play off of each other. One final thing to mention in terms of a factorial design, there's actually 2 types of designs depending upon the subjects. And basically what these differences are is a between subject design or within subjects design. And the only difference between these is the people in each of these conditions, are they the same people or are they different people? A between subject design is where there's different people in each one of these conditions. Every one of the experiments that I explained so far would be a between subjects design. When you're looking at the listening study, using pauses or not using pauses, you have basically your treatment group, your control group. You have above average, average, and below average listeners. Obviously, they're different people. And you have different people listening to the pause or the control group without the pause. Evaluative cognitive consistency. Obviously, they're different people, you know, in terms of high or low evaluative cognitive consistency, strong arguments, weak arguments, that kind of thing. Different people in your conditions. Your within subjects design is where you have the same subjects in each of these conditions. It's the same people that you're exposing to each of the 4 conditions. So again, you can just kind of envision the difference in the way it would play out. In a between subjects design, you could basically do the whole experiment all at once. You have 4 different conditions happening, but you know, you've got different people in each condition. If it's a within subjects design, then you've got to have each the people do those same, each of those conditions. A good example of the within subjects design, and again, I talked about this last week when we were talking about a different kind of design, but this would be a good way to conceptualize it. I was talking about the recognition that babies have of stories. I was talking about that study where pregnant women read a story out loud before birth, before their babies were born, and then after birth, they saw that the babies responded to that story differently than to other stories. And one of the things that I mentioned at the tail end of that, I think, I'm pretty sure, is that they didn't just respond to the story differently when their mother read it, they also responded to the story differently when somebody else read it, which meant they weren't just recognizing the mother's voice, they were recognizing the linguistic characteristics of the story itself, the rhythmic pattern, some of the phonetics, that kind of thing. So that would be a good example of a within design, because what you have here is, you have the story 1, which is our treatment story. This is the story that they read before birth. story 2, which, you know, a different story, the mother's reading the story, and somebody else that's not the mother's reading the story. So, you know, really what you have is a 2-by-2 design. Obviously here, you're gonna have the same infants. I mean, there's no real way that you could make the distinction in terms of, does the infant respond differently to this story compared to another story? Does he or she respond different to their mother reading it compared to their mother not reading it? So that would be a classic example of a within subjects design where you've got the same infants here. The infants are listening to this story by their mothers, a different story by their mothers. This story by someone else, another story by someone else. And we do find a main effect here, just mother, not mother, right? Babies respond to their mother's voice differently than they respond to other voices. And we find the main effect here as well. They respond differently to the story, independent of whether it was their mother or whether it wasn't their mother. So you found both different kinds of main effects here. Now, what I'm not sure of, at least the results that I read on the study, is if there was an interaction. Did they respond differently when their mother read the story compared to not mother? But they still responded different to the story, regardless of an interaction. So you had two main effects. A main effect just of the two stories, and a main effect of recognizing their mother or not their mother. But the main example for this is as an example of within subjects design. You know, same people, same infants in each one of these 4 conditions. So that's really the difference, the only difference between subjects and within subjects. Between subjects, it's different people in each one of these conditions. Within subjects, it's the same people in each one of these conditions. Question on the factorial? Zero, just since I mentioned the zero, first order, second order. Zero order means there is no interaction. First order means there is an interaction between your 2 variables. A second order interaction would only occur if you had 3 variables. And it meant that, you know, again, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but let me just draw up a simple one. We've got x1, x2, y1, y2, z1, x1, x2, y1, y2, z2. A second order interaction is where there's a 3-way interaction between 3 variables. It doesn't just interact between x and y, it interacts between x, y, and z. So for example, if you had this kind of design right here, and you found that this group was different than all the other groups, including different than this group, it means there isn't just an effect of y, there isn't just an effect of x, and there's not just an effect of z, but when you combine x1, y2, and z1, for some reason you get something different. That would be a second order effect. Again, there are third order effects and fourth order effects, but that gets unrealistically complicated because most studies don't do that. So a second order effect would only occur when you have 3 independent variables. First order effect is the kind that I've been explaining in terms of our examples where you have 2 variables and there's an interaction. Oh, just out of curiosity, for the one that I just put up, 2 levels of x, y, and z, what would be your factorial statement? 2 by 2 by 2, which means there's how many independent variables?
3.
How many levels of each variable?
2.
How many total conditions?
A lot.
A lot, more than one. Yeah, 8, right, just, you know, just multiply 2 by 2 is 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. Yes, sir.
Kind of one of the early concepts I didn't really understand. You were like 2 by 2 by 2 by 3. You was like, how many variables is it? You were like, it's 3 variables at that point. Is it just based on how many actual, like, units it is, like, you put up, or what?
Well, in effect, anytime you see a factorial statement, it tells you 3 pieces of information. How many variables are there? The number of numbers is the number of variables. There's only 2 numbers here, so there's 2
Oh, right,
independent
the actual
variables.
number of numbers. Okay.
The number of numbers is the number of variables. Each number tells you how many levels there are of each variable. Multiplying it out tells you the total conditions. So in the one statement, it tells you all 3 of those things. How many variables, how many levels of each variable, and how many total conditions. Those 3 pieces of information in the one statement. Okay. Yeah. That's pretty good and pretty simple. A lot of times that's unnecessarily complicated. And you feel pretty good about being able to distinguish main effects compared to interactions?
Now I might as well ask one.
Sure, go ahead.
Alright. So for your, when you had your mom and, you know, your mom and stories one, and you found a main effect both sides with them, so even though the study is doing both of them, can you draw two separate conclusions? Like the other one didn't even exist?
Oh,
Like,
sure.
You could do
Yeah,
that?
yeah, good, and that's where you're testing the main effect. You could say, babies recognize their mother's voice as something different than non-mother's voices, completely independent of the story. Just, they recognize their mother as somebody different than not their mother. And you also prove a main effect. Baby recognizes the story compared to a different story, regardless of who's reading the story. So you can, and actually that's what a lot of studies do. They say, is there a main effect of this variable? Yes or no? Is there a main effect of this variable? Yes or no? Is there an interaction between the two? And you might not find any interaction between the two, but you still produce a lot of results because you show each of these things affect themselves, yeah. And that's actually a good point, because what you seem to imply, or actually more directly state, you kind of have two different experiments going on there at the
Yeah,
same
that's what
time,
I'm
right?
wondering.
You're studying the recognition of the mother's voice, and you're studying the recognition of the story, but by doing it at the same time, you can also look for interactions. Yeah, good point. That does our experiments, as, you know, as a methodology. Any retrospective questions on any of our stuff with experiments? Okay. That leads us up to a whole new type of methodology, which is textual analysis.
Okay.
This is something that has gotten a lot broader. This is a very, 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 very broad area. It can encompass multiple different types of things. So I'm going to just kind of give you an idea in terms of how broad the area is, but then we'll get more specific in terms of a particular type of textual analysis that we'll do first, and then different ways that it's done and stuff like that. Traditionally, textual analysis was referring to printed text, you know, printed communication. However, that definition or description no longer would apply. Now textual analysis and the methods used in textual analysis covers any kind of physically recorded communication. And by physically recorded, it doesn't mean that it has to be recorded before you study it. Recording it could be part of your study. I mean, you could have people carry on a conversation interpersonally, record it, make transcripts, and you could do textual analysis. So it doesn't have to be an already recorded thing, like, you know, something on television or something that's published in a book. That obviously could be done with textual analysis as well. But you could record the communication as part of the study, you know, as part of your methodology. So really, textual analysis now becomes any physically recorded communication. It can be people, or it can be, you know, print. It can be mass media. You know, there's a lot of content analysis that's done on television shows, a lot of content analysis done on movies, content analysis done on advertisements, content analysis done on newspapers and magazine articles. You know, I mean, just one example just kind of came to mind when they're comparing things like the number of advertisements in one kind of magazine compared to another kind of magazine, or the types of products that are advertised in Cosmopolitan compared to Forbes, or something like that. You know, that's all content analysis. It could also be people. You know, you could do content analysis of, you know, people talking, speeches, everyday conversations, everything. So this has become just tremendously broad. Again, there's different types of textual analysis. Rhetorical criticism is actually a type of textual analysis. Did any of you ever have rhetorical criticism SP 402 when it was still being taught? Not likely to be taught anymore. Excuse me. A lot of types of rhetorical criticism can be textual analysis. Your text goes into some of that, but we're not going to do so much on rhetorical criticism. Discourse analysis can be textual analysis. Now we will do some more stuff with discourse analysis starting on Thursday, I hope. I think we'll be through with this by then. Performance studies, which is another just fascinating area, and again, your text goes into a little bit on performance studies as well, as a type of textual analysis. And performance studies is where, it's not where you're studying performance, it's where you're using performance as a way of representing and a way of communicating something. Instead of like giving a speech, you're using some kind of interpretive performance as your message, and it's just a fascinating link. It's kind of like a link between theater and communication, really, because basically you're theatrically performing your particular message, and it's just a fascinating area. There's even a journal, Performance Text Quarterly or Performance Studies Quarterly, something like that. So all of those kinds of things would be, would be textual analysis. The main kind of textual analysis that we're going to focus on is content analysis. And it's a particular type of content analysis that we're going to focus on. Content analysis is where you're actually studying the content of communication. Again, it could be people, it could be books, it could be poetry. Really, it could be anything. And again, we're using the word communication here really broad. Technically speaking, content analysis is studying any kind of symbolic message. So you could use content analysis with visual arts. And again, when we talk about, well, I'll probably do some of this. I'll mention a couple of these examples here, and then I'll talk about some other kinds of examples probably next week when we do some stuff on interpretive analysis. But we really do some of this, even though we do it in a different way in the arts class, where we're doing content analysis of certain kind of paintings, as well as content analysis of certain kind of poetry, or things like that. It can be any communicative symbol. It can be visual symbols, it can be written symbols, it can be musical symbols. You could do a content analysis of music. You could do a fascinating content analysis of Beethoven's use of minor and major key, and things like this. It's just that'd be a pretty limited study, but you'd have a lot of different kinds of samples, especially Beethoven's None. So content analysis can be any kind of symbolic messages, words, actions, pictures, anything. I do want to make one quick distinction, because we're going to do the first, not so much the second, between manifest content analysis and latent content analysis. Manifest content analysis, and I'll give you a more precise kind of description, but let me just kind of illustrate real quick what the difference is. Manifest content analysis is where you're studying actual observable communication. Text that you can read, people's communication that you can record and listen to or transcribe. Advertisements that you can see, and you're studying the advertisements themselves. Content of television shows. There's a ton of media studies that do content analysis. When you're talking about things like the amount of sexuality in primetime television, or the amount of sexuality or profanity in primetime television now compared to primetime television of the 70s or the 80s. The amount of explicit profanity in certain forms of music, comparing, if you're looking at different genres of music, and now this would be a no-brainer here, but you're looking at things like folk, country, reggae, and rap, is there a difference in the frequency of profanity? And that would be a content analysis, and at least we would probably have a reasonably good prediction there that one of them might use more profanity than the others might. All kinds of things like this, studying music videos. So there's a lot of media stuff that's content analysis. It really is just tremendously broad, and a lot of media studies do that. The difference is manifest content analysis, you're looking at the actual messages themselves, or the actual symbols. The observable communication behavior, whether it's pictures, words, whatever it might be. And again, it could be anything. It could be music, it could be images, it could be advertising, it could be conversation, the list goes on. Latent content analysis is where you're looking at people's perceptions or interpretations of messages. A lot of latent content analysis is more qualitative than it is quantitative, because you're describing, you're explaining. Remember all those things that qualitative and quantitative do differently. Latent content analysis is much more qualitative, very interpretive. You're describing, you're explaining, that kind of thing. Our focus is going to be on manifest content analysis, because we're focusing on the actual observable communication symbols or messages. Manifest is it's actually physically observable in one way. Now, when we say observable, we're using that broad. Observable could mean hearing, if you're listening to music. That's still observable. Latent is the perception, though. The manifest Even with manifest content analysis, there's a qualitative aspect to it. Yeah.
I'm kind of confused on two concepts now. Like with manifest is the actual study of the physical object or the physical, or like necessarily physical object, but like you said, like a hearing, or the actual like paper or something, where latent is just the concept we're analyzing, like,
Let me say that in a way that I would think is much more simple. Manifest content analysis is studying the message. Latent content analysis is studying the perception of the message. Manifest content analysis, you're not concerned about how people perceive the advertisements. You're concerned of what's in the advertisement. How many advertisements do this or how many advertisements do that. You're studying the message itself. You're not studying the perception of the message. Again, that's the simplest way of thinking about it. Manifest content analysis, you're studying the message. Latent content analysis, you're studying the perceptions of the message. Presidential debates, manifest content analysis, you're actually looking at what the candidates said in the debates. Latent content analysis, you're looking at what people's perceptions of what they said would be. And again, that's much more qualitative than manifest. Now, even with manifest, though, typically there's a qualitative aspect, even though typically manifest content analysis is thought of as being, is quantitative. But remember back when we talked about differences between types of variables, the nominal variable, where you just have different types or different categories of something. The part of manifest content analysis that is qualitative is just the assignment of types of categories. That in and of itself is a qualitative thing, where you're saying we've got 4 different categories of messages here. But why it's quantitative is because almost all manifest content analysis, once you've got your categories determined, you then start counting numbers. How frequently is profanity used in this kind of music compared to this kind of music compared to this kind of music, or many other kinds of examples as well. I'll give you more than enough examples of content analysis by the time we're done. Give you a good precise definition of manifest content analysis. In general, what it's dealing with is actual messages instead of perception of messages. But it is worth making note of a more precise kind of description. Manifest content analysis is the objective and systematic identification or explanation or description. The objective and systematic identification, explanation, or description of manifest communication. And what manifest communication means is it's overt, it's explicit, it's observable. No. Okay. I always want to do that. I'm sorry.
Wow, all right.
That was harsh.
That changed mentality real quick.
But there was that second there, right? Manifest content analysis is the objective and systematic
Explanation?
identification,
Oh.
explanation, or description of manifest communication. And what manifest communication means is it's overt, it's explicit, it's observable. It's not what people think, it's not what people perceive. You can observe the message, it's an explicit message, it's overt. I'll say it again just to make up for me saying no. It's the objective and systematic identification, explanation, or description of manifest communication. And what manifest communication means is it's overt, it's explicit, it's directly observable. Now there is an important thing there, more than that just being a definition. Those first couple of phrases, that first phrase, objective and systematic, that becomes a critically important thing because it's what distinguishes content analysis from interpretive analysis. Interpretive analysis, we allow for the fact that the individual researcher or the person that's doing the interpretation is doing their interpretation of some kind of text or some kind of communication. Content analysis is trying to do this a little more from the positivist paradigm, where you're trying to be as objective as possible. You're trying to not let your own influences and your own perceptions influence things, and you're doing this in a systematic way. Content analysis isn't just sitting back and casually listening to the presidential debate and saying, well, here's some of the observations I would make from my quick, intuitive content analysis. That's not content analysis. By saying objective and systematic, it means it's very much done with the same kind of rigor as our experimental designs are. I mean, just from all the experimental designs we went through, you can see how much rigor and how much precision and how much, systematic processing has to be done to do those experiments the right way. Same thing happens in content analysis. It's not just a casual observation or a casual reading of something and saying, here's the results of the content analysis. It's got to be a very objective process. It's got to be very systematic. There's certain steps, certain procedures, certain way of analyzing your data. It has to reach certain standards of reliability. Actually, we talked about this before in terms of the 70% minimum standard for raters or coders. Because when you're doing a content analysis, in order for it to be objective and systematic, it's almost never done by one person, because obviously what you get could be that person's perceptions, not the real message. So almost all content analysis has multiple observers that's coding and categorizing the communication, whatever it is, and then you have to get that inter-coder agreement. Now I'll come back to this, just as a summary after we've done a lot of stuff with content analysis. But remember that it has to be at least 70% agreement to be minimally acceptable. We talked about that in the first unit under things like reliability. This can be really, really, really broad. So first of all, you understand that manifest content analysis is one type of textual analysis. Rhetorical criticism is textual analysis. Performance studies is textual analysis. Discourse analysis is textual analysis. So there's multiple types. Manifest content analysis is one type of textual analysis. But this can still be really big and really broad. It can be public communication, like things that we see on television, things that we see in movies, things that are in magazines, things that are in newspapers. It could also be private communication. It could be things that go on in conversations in relationships. It could be things in family communication. It can be private kinds of things as well. It could be interactive or monologic. In other words, monologic. It could be listening to presidential speeches. Lots of content analyses have been done on presidential speeches, the same president, looking at multiple different kinds of speeches that the president has given, or comparing presidential speeches. There's been some just great kind of research done comparing things of presidents doing different administrations and some different kinds of things in terms of their presidential rhetoric. Well, that's monologic, because when the president's standing up there and giving a speech, like, let's say you wanted to compare the inaugural speeches of all modern presidents, and the modern era kind of begins in 1961 with John Kennedy, and would take us up to 2000. Well, it's almost to go into 2012, but so far it would take us to 2008, with President Obama. And you could compare the inaugural addresses of presidents over those different years, that kind of thing. Those would be monologic examples. Dialogic, you're dealing, or it wouldn't have to be dialogic, because that just means that there's two. But interactive means that it could be two people. You can do content analysis on conversations as well. They can be natural, meaning that they're naturally occurring things, or they could even be constructed tasks, even though most of the time it's going to be naturalistic kinds of things, but there are some exceptions. And again, they're typically quantitative, but again, there's so many examples. Lots of content analysis done with political communication, political speeches, political strategies, political debates. There's a ton of content analysis that's been done on political debates. A lot has been done on political language and different kinds of things with political language. Obviously, there's a lot done with advertising, different themes, different strategies for persuasion, those kinds of things. Lots of content analysis is done on news programs, in terms of the types of programs and variations between the programs. Some of the stuff when I was talking about, like Fox Network being more conservative than your other network, there's been content and analytic studies done, in terms, or those kinds of research done, showing that, the content of some of these things that are presented on one news network ends up being more conservative than what's presented on another network. So there's been a lot done on news broadcasts.
You said something about natural, and I didn't really catch it, like natural content analysis.
Yeah, what I was saying is in terms of the communication itself. It could be naturally occurring, where it's out there and you just record it and observe it, or you could create certain kinds of tasks as well. Like, for example, let's say that I create some kind of conflict scenario and then do some kind of physical recording of different people trying to resolve those conflicts. And I could do a content analysis of the way that they go about trying to resolve the conflict.
Okay.
But that's a task I created rather than something that was naturally occurring. But most of your content analysis is naturally occurring.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, I'm just kind of giving you a feel for how broad this is. News broadcast, lots of content analysis done in media studies on television programs in terms of the content, the language, the imagery. Lots of content analysis has been done on music, both things like music videos in terms of the visual imagery, as well as like the content of music and the themes in music and stuff like this. movies, I mean, really, the list just goes on and on. Lots of interpersonal stuff, language, when you're looking at a lot of things in terms of the differences. And again, I'm gonna give you some more examples when we talk about the specific different units of analysis. But things comparing male-female language, a lot of that is content analytic kind of studies in terms of females tend to use more of this kind of language, males tend to use more of this kind of language. Lots of content analysis studies done in terms of relationships, conflict solving, those kinds of things. Even with child development and infant development, there's a lot of stuff in terms of content analysis. So this is just a tremendously broad area covering mass communication, political communication, interpersonal communication, small group communication. There's just lots and lots and lots of different kinds of examples. I'm actually glad that we're not going to get as far as I thought we might. I have a handout that I was going to give you, but it's not going to be relevant because we're not going to get all that far. So, got a good understanding what manifest content analysis is. One type of textual analysis. Manifest differs than latent. Latent is the perception of the message. Manifest is the actual message. The objective and systematic identification, explanation, and description of manifest communication, which means it's overt, it's explicit, it's observable. Well, whenever you're doing manifest content analysis, the very first step is you develop or have chosen certain kinds of categories to fit your content in. All content analysis is a categorical kind of analysis. You've got some kind of set of categories or a category with multiple different types in there, and what you're doing is you're coding your content into those different categories. Some categories are predetermined. And when you're dealing with predetermined categories, they could take one of two different kinds of forms. Predetermined categories could be categories that are just intuitively obvious. For example, if you were doing something like the use of profanity in primetime television, well, you pretty much have a predetermined category. There is profanity, there isn't profanity. And now you can do other things too, like different types of profanity, the severity of the profanity, so it could get more complex, which wouldn't be predetermined. But all you were doing is just identifying how many primetime television shows on the 4 major networks between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock, in the evening, how many of them include profanity. And all you're really doing is saying, do they use profanity or not? Well, you pretty much have a predetermined set of categories, using profanity, not using profanity. When you're talking about things, and again, I'll use this as an example again, but one of the kinds of content analysis that's been done a lot with political campaigning is political advertising, looking at things like negative advertising and the frequency with which different candidates use negative advertising. Well, you can see, you really pretty much you have 3 possibilities. There is negative advertising, there's not negative advertising, and then there's an element of mix. Now, the negative advertising is where you criticize your opponent. The non-negative advertising is where you build up your own qualifications. And then there's some that's mixed, where you do make some criticisms of your opponent, but you also build up yourself and your expertise. So that's a pretty logical set of categories, right? You either criticize the opponent, you build your own self up, or you do a mix of both, that kind of thing. Another classic kind of obvious example, there's been a lot of studies in campaigns saying how much of the campaign speeches or the political advertisements, how much of them focus on the candidate's image, their overall image in terms of how credible they are and that kind of thing, compared to focusing on issues, what their stand is on Social Security, what their stand is on taxes, what their stand is on foreign policy. And again, you have many different kinds of variations there, but if then you were doing it that simple, you would simply be looking at how many issue-oriented ads are there, how many image-oriented ads are there. And I guess you could include a category that might be mixed. So some categories are predetermined just because it's a logical kind of thing, Another example, this will be on a handout, but when I give you the handout, then we're looking at some samples. One of the studies that we did when I was teaching the SP 410, the Advanced Interpersonal class, where the people would interview people in relationships. They would ask them how often that they had conflicts with their partner. And then, you know, after they would say something like, you know, how many times on the average a week or something like that, the follow-up question would be, if you consider that a lot, not much, or average. Well, that's a predetermined logical set, right? You're placing it into 3 evaluative categories. Is that a lot, is that average, or is that not much? You know, it's a predetermined logical set. There are a lot of predetermined categories, however, that has been the results of previous research that's been done. For instance, back when I was talking about things like political ads, there actually are a lot more complex categories of political ads than just, are they positive, are they negative, are they image-oriented, are they issue-oriented? There's a whole variety of different types of political ads. Well, this has been pretty extensively studied, and a lot of times people that's doing a content analysis of political ads, rather than creating your whole category system all anew, you simply say this has already been verified as a legitimate set of categories for political ads, and we're just going to use this particular system in analyzing, you know, the political ads of the 2012 presidential campaign. For any of you that have had the small groups class, I think that Sarah, how many of you had 120? Well, does Sarah go into interaction analysis? You know, where you have all those different categories of shows friendliness, shows agreement, ask for agreement, or ask for information. I'm going to give you a sample of that when we talk about, you know, get into the specifics on the handout. But that's a classic kind of thing. You've got actually interaction process analysis is what that is. You've got a preset list of so many categories. I think there's 12 different categories that when a group is carrying on a discussion, the comments that they make can be identified and categorized into 12 different categories. And then you coordinate and balance them. You're looking at how many times was information asked for relative to how many times was information provided. How many comments were made that showed agreement relative to how many comments made that showed disagreement. And you've got a preset set of 12 different categories that you already take into that particular analysis. So what I'm saying is predetermined categories, you're doing the content analysis, but your categories are already set, and they can already be set for 1 of 2 reasons. It could be because it's just logical, there's only this many options, or it could be some previous study or studies have already developed a category system, and you could simply, you know, take that to the drawing board and use the predetermined set of categories. Sometimes, however, you need to generate your categories. Particularly if you're studying something new, or you're studying something a new way, or you're studying something uniquely different, you might generate your new categories. And this is a very lengthy thing. Now, your text does go into some explanation of this, but I don't think you need to know all the details, but this is can be a very lengthy thing. If you have to generate your own categories, what you do, you start at ground zero, you collect a very large sample of whatever it is that you're going to be studying, and then you have your multiple observers view or listen or whatever you're doing. They have to, you know, observe all these different samples of communication, and they start generating the idea of, we seem to see certain kinds of content emerge. And these are the categories that we see. For example, if you wanted to do a content analysis of major themes in primetime television shows, look at where that would be with ground zero, right? I mean, just think of how many different themes there are in primetime TV shows. All your dramas, all your comedies, everything. Well, you're kind of starting here with this large sample of all these TV shows, and then you'd have to view a whole bunch of these, multiple observers, and then you would start generating, and you'd say, well, I can see this as one theme, and this seems to be a theme, and this seems to be a theme. And then what you do is you end up developing from that, and again, you have a lot of coordination going on between your observers, you end up developing maybe something like 7 thematic categories. These are 7 major themes that seem to be addressed in primetime television shows. Now, a lot of times, obviously, you know, you might include an other category or something like that. Then, you have to have all of your observers categorize all the content into those themes, and you want to be sure that everything can be categorized into those themes, because if you end up, let's say you're picking 100 different samples of shows, and you're finding that 50 of them don't go into any of your 7 categories, well then obviously your category system isn't complete, you're missing some category systems. And so you've got to develop some new categories or refine this. So this is an ongoing thing. I mean, it's almost like you might be doing 2 or 3 studies, little mini studies, just to create and generate what your categories are going to be. Finally, when you have a definitive set of categories that the vast majority of all your sample can be included in, then you're likely to include an other category just to account for some, some exceptions, that might not go into the other categories. Then that's where you've got your category system set. Then you're really ready to go to the drawing board and start your study. So you might sample and generate your categories off of this many, but then that's to refine your categories. Then once you get your categories set, you say, okay, now we're ready to begin the study. So there's a whole lot of studying and research that goes into just generating your categories anew. And it does give you some appreciation for some of these studies that have developed some of these predetermined sets of categories. And some of them are just really intricately fascinating, and some of them are, a little more simple, that kind of thing. There are some things that your categories, these are, your two types, your two approaches, I guess I would say, to getting your categories. There are some certain standards, however, or criteria that your categories have to meet, and I kind of implied this a little bit anyway. One thing is your categories have to be exhaustive. And this is real similar for those of you with the really good memories when we were talking about some of the stuff in the first unit with nominal variables. What does exhaustive mean?
That
Everything has to
everything
be able to
we
fit
go-
into.
Yeah, it covers everything, right? It means that every one of your samples can fit into one of your categories. That's why a lot of times you include an other, but there again, your other should be a relative small minority. I mean, maybe 5%, 10% in the other category. If you've got 50% in the other category, your content categories, aren't complete. So it's exhaustive, meaning that everything can be categorized in one or the other. Another one is it's mutually exclusive. Here's where that has to be the case. Now, when we were talking about nominal variables earlier in the semester, we said that you could have exceptions, and the example on one of the handouts I gave you is where there was a question on there that said, check all of these. What student organizations do you belong to? Check all that apply. Well, that's not mutually exclusive because you could check multiple different organizations. But when you're doing content analysis, it has to be mutually exclusive. Otherwise, your data just wouldn't even make sense. And what mutual exclusive means is if you put something in one category, it is not also put or can't be put in another category. I mean, you see what that would actually do when it comes time to compare your frequencies of how many things occur in the categories. If some of the same samples of communication are in more than one category, then your statistics would be meaningless, So it has to be mutually exclusive, and what's meant by mutually exclusive is if you put a content or a sample in one category, it cannot go in any other category. It goes in this one, and it doesn't go in any of the other ones. A third criteria that's required is the categories have to be equivalent, and this is right along the lines of the nominal variable anyway. There's no hierarchical difference in your categories, they're just different. Now, you end up with differences in terms of the frequencies with which communication falls in each of your categories, but the category itself is still, equivalent. To say this technique or this ad or this strategy or something like that, there's no difference between them. And one other criteria that is worth mentioning is that your categories are manageable, and by manageable it means just that there's a practical number of them rather than trying to get too far. I mean, and you can see that a lot of times what happens when you're generating your own categories, you end up with a lot more categories than you're actually going to use, but then you can sort of take a step back and start grouping categories together. These things seem to be able to be clustered together under a bigger topic, that kind of thing. So when we say it's manageable, there's no absolute number. It just means that there's a practical, manageable number of categories. I mean, back to my example of things like themes in primetime TV shows. If you were really specific, you could probably come up with 100 different categories there, but that's way, way, way unmanageable. You'd want to try to limit it down to maybe, 5 or 10 or something like that. So what you're doing is you're taking a lot of these specific themes and you're putting them together under a broader topic. Like, you could have a theme about the environment, and you could have a theme about, the economy, and you could have a theme about unemployment. And what you might do then is you might say, well, these seem to be social issues or something like that, so it has to be a reasonable limit. We just scratched the surface, but that's actually good, because then on Thursday we'll really pick up on how to do the content analysis, and I'll have it handed out for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Second that.